This happened when I was very young. Since this is technically still an active investigation, I will omit certain details from the story. For some context, I grew up in a small town in Wyoming. As a non-outdoorsy kind of guy, growing up in the cowboy state wasn't exactly exciting on any level. As a side note, I didn't really appreciate my home state when I was younger. When I was going through my rebellious stage, I moved to Chicago and went to school there for 3 years. After I finished my education, I moved to San Francisco, where I resided until 2016. By then, I had my fill of city life, and I hightailed it back to Wyoming. I now live in Cheyenne. In my hometown, there was virtually no crime in my area whatsoever. It was the kind of place where you could leave your doors unlocked at night. The only thing that we kids had to contend with was boredom. However, there was one incident that shook the entire community, one that I happened to witness firsthand. The year was 1991. I was in elementary school at the time. Back then, the school that I went to was located between several small coal mining towns that didn't have schools of their own. Some of these communities were an hour away, and for whatever reason, the school didn't provide bus rides to students who lived in these remote areas. My mom didn't get off of work until 4, and it took her about 45 minutes to come pick me up from school. There was a playground located in the schoolyard, where students who were being picked up by their parents would hang out, unsupervised. On the day in question, me and another kid named Thomas were the only ones on the playground. When class let out that day, I noticed that there was an old pickup truck sitting in the parking lot, ominously facing the playground. I thought nothing of it at the time. I didn't know Thomas very well, and we didn't really talk to each other. I remember that I was trying to do chin-ups on the monkey bars, while he was sitting on the bench near the parking lot. I eventually got bored of the monkey bars and walked over to sit on the slide so I could get out of the sun for a while. Shortly after, I overheard Thomas talking to someone. No, I don't know you, and I'm not going with you." I was facing the opposite direction. The main playground area sat between the slide and the bench Thomas was sitting on. But when I looked over, I did make out a figure standing next to Thomas. The only thing I seem to recall about them is that they were wearing a pair of jeans. My memory gets a little fuzzy after this, which is disappointing because I pride myself on having a pretty good memory. The only thing I remember after noticing the mysterious person talking to Thomas was seeing the truck speeding out of the parking lot and then realizing that Thomas was gone. I didn't see Thomas getting into the truck. I didn't even realize that Thomas had been kidnapped until the day after. My mom arrived about 10 minutes later. The next day I was called into the principal's office and was asked by a police officer if I had seen Thomas the day before. I told him about the strange truck in the parking lot and seeing someone talking to him while I was on the slide. Unfortunately, the story does not have a happy ending. Thomas's body was found in a ditch a week later in the neighboring state of North Dakota, which is less than an hour away from the school. This tragedy shook the entire community. A lot of parents blamed the school for not having someone out there watching us, which is a perfectly valid point in my opinion. After what happened to Thomas, not only did they have a chaperone out there watching us, but a police car was also stationed in the parking lot. It wasn't until I got older that I realized just how lucky I was not to be taken that day. I potentially came very close to meeting the same fate as Thomas. The scariest part of all this is that they were never able to find who abducted him or what their motive was. It just happened out of nowhere for seemingly no reason whatsoever. It's a scary thought to imagine someone just waking up one day and deciding to kidnap and murder an innocent child right out of the schoolyard. I don't think living in constant fear is healthy. However, be aware that evil lurks everywhere, even in some of the most remote, unassuming places.
This is a true story that involves my firstborn son. He was in second grade at the time, and we were living in Tacoma, Washington. It's been 27 years since this occurred, but it still haunts me to this day. A little backstory to put these events into perspective. It was January of 1995. It was a traumatic month for our family. My son, up to this point, had been walking to and from his bus stop, which was a block and a half away from our house, located at the bottom of a steep hill. He'd have to walk down in on the mornings and up in the afternoons. There was an elderly man from Korea who lived across the street from us, who had been brutally murdered, which is an unrelated incident. But needless to say, tensions were high in our neighborhood around the time. We lived in a small complex with 4 houses, each one with its own fenced-in yard. There was an entry gate that enclosed everything. My son used to take a shortcut through the alleyway that ran behind the houses to get to his bus stop. He had done it so many times that it had become normal, and there was not a worry in the world as to our son's safety until the day in question. That day started like any other. I woke at around 6 to get the kids ready for school. Our eldest son was the first one to leave. He was in special ed and had to be bused across the city. Then our eldest son left the house. I watched him as he walked through the complex, then out the gate, and disappeared down the alleyway. Fast forward to the afternoon. I knew that my eldest son would be coming home from school soon. I was busy in the house, tending to chores, when I heard a frantic knocking at my door. I opened it and saw through the screen door that it was my next-door neighbor, and she had a terrified look on her face. "Hey, what's wrong?" She then told me she saw someone trying to lure my son into their car. I immediately screamed for my husband, and we both ran out of the house. To our horror, there was someone in a white sedan reaching through the driver's side window of the car, pulling my son by his shirt. If you aren't a parent, you can't imagine how terrifying this was to witness. I went ballistic while my husband ran towards the car screaming,
"Hey, get the hell away from my son!"
Our son managed to pull away from the driver and quickly backed against the perimeter fence. I saw that every time he went to move, the vehicle kept moving to prevent him from escaping. At this point, the neighbors that had lived across the alley heard all the commotion, and they leaped over their fence and sprinted to the front of the sedan. And the others swept our son into his arms and quickly brought him over to us. The assailant just sat in his car, stone silent, not moving at all. I remember staring into his soulless eyes. I had never seen so much emptiness in my life. It sent shivers down my back. It was like I was looking into the very eyes of the devil himself. The driver actually sat there long enough that we were able to get a complete physical description of him, the vehicle, and his license plate information. My next-door neighbor called the police, but of course by the time they got there, the man had already left the scene. It still freaks me out to think about what would have happened to our son if my next-door neighbor hadn't seen what she saw that day. We might have never seen our son again. Another thing that upsets me is right before the man took off, he pulled out a Polaroid camera and took a couple of my son. That really got under my skin. When a police officer finally came, he looked like he was fresh out of high school. I remember him eyeing me skeptically and said I was just being a hysterical mom. Like, what the fuck? Is that what you tell someone who just saw their son almost get kidnapped? My advice to all police is that they don't send a rookie out to investigate a child abduction case, and also don't hire fucking morons. This incident has scarred me for life. I wouldn't let our son out of my sight and made him hold my hand everywhere we went. I went to extremes to protect my other children as well. So if you think that nothing bad can ever happen to you, please think again and take caution with your children. To end things on a happy note, my son is now 35 years old. happily married and is a successful auto mechanic with his own shop. It is a dangerous world out there. God bless you all and stay safe.
When I was a kid, my family would often frequent this Italian restaurant near the city's airport called Martino's. My great-uncle discovered this place during his quest to find a genuine Chicago-style hot dog outside of the Windy City. On the day in question, I went to Martino's with my dad and my uncle for lunch. I believe this was in the middle of my school's summer break, and my mom opted to stay home that day for whatever reason. After we were done, the three of us soon returned to my dad's car. My uncle got in the passenger seat and I climbed into the back. We hadn't gotten very far from the restaurant when we noticed an older pickup truck tailing us, driving very erratically. The truck kept accelerating, pulling right up to our rear bumper and then backing off, only to do it over again. Evidently, they were in a big hurry, trying to get my dad to go faster or to move out of their way. My old man isn't the type of guy who takes shit from anybody, except my mom. So he kept driving at the speed limit, refusing to move over. I thought the truck would eventually pass us. Instead, it got right on our bumper and stayed there. From the back seat, I couldn't quite see into the rearview mirror, but I remember my dad saying that the driver was so angry that he was banging on his steering wheel and screaming at us. The truck stayed behind us until we came to the next stoplight, which of course was red. As soon as we came to a stop, the driver's side door of the pickup truck flew open and a younger guy stepped out. He was maybe in his late 20s to early 30s. My dad put his car into park and opened his door. Before the guy could even get a word out, my dad said very calmly, "You need to get back in your truck." For a second, the guy seemed taken off guard and looked as though he was about to back down. But then he took a step forward, staring my dad in the eyes. My uncle and I were both preparing for the worst when the stoplight suddenly flicked back to green. The guy sprinted back to his truck and tore off down the road. If my dad had been shaken, he didn't show it. My uncle and I were definitely on edge from the encounter, but we took comfort in knowing that we wouldn't see that truck again. Or so we thought. It was quite a ways up the road until we reached another intersection. We were in the right lane, and the truck was in the far left turn lane. Upon seeing it, my dad burst into laughter and made a wisecrack. He was in a big hurry to go nowhere. Hey, watch this. As we came to a stop, my dad rolled down his window.
Hey, jackass!
When the driver looked towards us, my dad did a perfect imitation of him, banging on the steering wheel and shouting incoherently, the whole bit. That's when the driver lost his shit. The pickup truck backed up and came tearing out of the turn lane, barreling straight across the road, directly at us. My dad quickly turned down the intersecting road, the truck following behind, tailgating us again as my dad pushed the car to its limits. We were hauling ass, but the truck was quickly closing in. Just up the road there was an interstate ramp. My dad made a ballsy move. He waited until the very last second, and then quickly skidded our car into the ramp lane. As we climbed up the ramp, the last thing we heard was the truck's horn blaring as it disappeared out of sight. Thankfully, after that, we made it back home safely. When my mom saw how freaked out my uncle and I were, she pressured my dad into telling the story. I'm pretty certain she chewed him out right after, especially for his imitation gag. But as was typical, my dad was pleased with himself. We still talk about what happened that day every now and again, and we used to laugh about it, but now, even my dad doesn't crack jokes about it anymore. I think he finally understands just how deranged that man was and the potential danger we were in. At any moment, things could have turned deadly. This happened 2 years ago, when I was a senior in high school. It was a Saturday night, and my friends and I were hanging out at my place, like we usually did. Around 11:30, my two friends, who I will call Mike and Steve, said that they were ready to go back home. Neither of them had a car at the time, so I had to drive them home, which I had done several times before. I always dropped off Mike first because he lived further away. However, getting to Mike's house from mine was pretty simple, as it was pretty much just a straight shot. Then I'd drop off Steve on my way back. That night, we were about halfway to Mike's when we hit a red light at an intersection. We were in the middle lane, and this silver sedan was pulled up next to us in the right lane, which allowed you to either go straight or turn right. When the light turned green, we both went. The sedan suddenly cut us off, causing me to slam on the brake. The driver kept going as I laid on the horn. The fuck is this guy's problem? We were driving behind the sedan for a little while, and eventually ended up at another red light. There were 2 lanes at this intersection, so I pulled up into the left lane, so our vehicles were parallel. The driver in the sedan looked to be about our age. He rolled down his window and began flipping us off. At this point, I became furious and rolled down my window. Why don't you learn how to drive, you jackass? I started giving him the finger as well, and so did Mike, who was sitting up front. Steve was a pretty chill guy and just sat back and enjoyed the show, as Mike and I were getting into it with the guy. He started asking us if we wanted to fight, which I thought was hilarious, since there were 3 of us and 1 of him. The light finally changed, and this time, we were in front of him. That's when the intensity of this situation changed completely. The sedan got so close that his bumper was practically touching mine. He also flipped on his high beams and began swerving his car like some kind of lunatic. I was horrified that he would ram into the back of my car, causing us to crash. I started to speed up, hoping to gain some distance, but he tailed me no matter how fast I went. Meanwhile, Mike and Steve were understandably freaking out. This went on for about 2 or 3 minutes. He stayed on our tail and kept swerving. When the shoulder got wider, he quickly sped up, went around us, then veered into our lane, cutting us off a second time. This guy was insane. I slammed on the brakes going about 50 miles per hour. I still don't know how I managed to miss him. As I pulled over, he sped off down the road and actually cut somebody else off at the next intersection. But after that, he disappeared. And the 3 of us were pretty shaken up. That was the first time in my life that I had ever encountered anyone who was that unhinged. It was probably a good thing that we didn't end up fighting, because he would probably be one of those guys who bites your nose off. Nothing else happened the rest of the way to Mike's. The whole time, I looked behind us, just to make sure that we weren't being followed. Thankfully, we never saw that guy again. This experience is somewhat amusing to look back on now, but when it was happening, it was terrifying. At any moment, he could have rammed into us, causing me to lose control of the car and crash. The way that he swerved into our lane indicated that he clearly had no regard for our safety, or even his own. I've never antagonized another driver like that since, and I'd advise you all to avoid doing that as well. You never really know if the person behind the wheel is a lunatic.
I was about 5 years old when this happened. It's one of the only vivid memories I have from that time in my life. My family is originally from Europe, but later immigrated to America. My grandmother would come to visit us for about 3 months every year. During the summer in question, my grandmother was staying with us, and she planned on taking me to the local park near my house. I was waiting in the driveway while she was inside, gathering up a few things. I then noticed a black car slowly cruising down the street before coming to a stop in front of my driveway. I didn't find it unusual at first. Perhaps they were just using the driveway to turn around. Then, a black male exited the car and began walking toward me. I just kind of stood there in shock as he closed in. The man then outstretched his hands like he was going to grab me. I remember thinking that he was the boogeyman, and I stood there, frozen, as he came within a few inches of reaching me. But I finally was able to snap out of my trance and backed away until I got to the front door and started banging on it to alert my grandmother. I heard the man behind me saying something under his breath before he ran back to his car. My grandmother opened the door as soon as he backed out of the driveway and sped off down the road. I told her what just happened, but she was a stubborn woman and didn't believe me. Looking back, I don't blame her. I was known for having quite the imagination, but this was not one of those instances where I was making something up for attention. Now that I'm older, the situation frightens me even more. Some random stranger pulled into our driveway and tried to snatch up a child in broad daylight.
This event took place during the summer of 2021. I was 16 at the time. Myself and a couple of friends, Adam, Ross, and my girlfriend Nevy, were planning to meet up for a birthday party. Our childhood friend, Faith, was turning 16. She wanted to celebrate by getting drunk in the forest outside of our local park. Faith was one of those mischievous types, always finding any possible way to get everyone into some sort of trouble, always had to be the center of attention, and didn't do too well with accountability. So later that day, we all met up outside of a local shopping center, where we waited for a taxi to take us to the party. Our parents weren't really clued in on what was happening. A little while later, the cab arrived, and we piled in. An uneasy feeling swept over me as soon as my eyes and the driver's eyes met. Something inside me told me that I should just go home. The driver was an old, scruffy-looking man, maybe in his late 50s. And the smell, my God, it was like his last passengers were roadkill. I awkwardly looked at my friends, all talking amongst each other, completely oblivious. I tried my best not to look uncomfortable. I'll never see this man again after this cab ride, so I decided to just deal with it. After what felt like hours, the driver pulled into the parking lot, and we all got out of the taxi. One of my other friends paid the driver and quickly shut the door. But before we could start walking away, the driver rolled down his window and asked, "What are you kids doing out here? I think you're a bit too old to be playing on playgrounds, don't you think?" Nevy and I looked at each other before responding. "It's our friend's birthday today, so we're just out here celebrating." "In the woods?" I saw Faith looking at me and smirking. I knew that she was going to say something stupid. But before she could get a word out, my friend Adam quickly cut in. "We aren't really the kind of people who like to party in clubs or bars. Hanging out in the woods is good enough for us." The cab driver grinned from ear to ear, revealing his gingivitis-infested mouth before saying, "Oh, okay then. I guess I'll see you later." What?" The man just smiled at us, then quickly rolled up his window and sped off. "What a freak," Faith chimed in, as she picked up her bag full of alcohol and started walking toward the trail. We then followed her into the woods. Once we got to the river, we all pretty much forgot about the creepy cab driver, and we all began drinking without hesitation. Faith pulled out a radio from her bag and began blasting some awful rave music. I'm more of a punk rock kind of guy, but hey, it was her birthday, so I just went with it. Maybe about an hour or so later, we were all pretty much wasted. Myself, Faith, and Ross began smoking some weed. I then stumbled back over to Nevy and sat down beside her, putting my arm around her while the others were still jumping around like a bunch of lunatics. I felt myself becoming very drowsy, and a few minutes later, I passed out. When I woke up, it was still dark outside, and I was still slouched beside Nevy. The rest of the group had seemed to calm down a bit as well. I guess all the alcohol and weed were finally catching up with everybody. I had to take a massive piss, so I began making my way toward a nearby bush and did my business. As I was zipping back up, I heard a sound in the distance, coming from the trail. I stood there for a minute and listened. It sounded like a man screaming at the top of his lungs. I quickly ran back to the others and turned off the radio.
What the fuck?
Shouted Faith. I motioned for her to be quiet, but of course, she was not going to listen. She switched the music back on and turned the volume up even louder and began singing in a drunken voice. It was really annoying. Nevy stood up and came over to me. What happened? I heard someone coming down the trail. I think they were screaming. When I said this, Ross picked up the radio and chucked it into the river.
What the fuck, Ross?
Shut your drunk ass up, Faith. We have company. Ross pointed to the trail, and we all looked over. My heart sank as soon as I saw a figure standing there, blocking the path. The man came out from the trees. We saw that he was holding a knife in his hand and was almost completely covered in a dark liquid. In his other hand, he was holding a carcass. Holy shit. I grabbed Nevy's hand as she stood behind me. What do you want, man? The man began mumbling to himself and laughing, shaking the dead animal as if it was some kind of trophy. The poor thing was a dead rabbit. The man then threw the rabbit onto the ground, right in front of us. Faith then stood up.
Get the fuck out of here, you freak!
She then picked up an empty bottle and threw it at the man, almost hitting him. The man stopped laughing and then glared at us.
You are really going to regret that.
He then began charging towards us. Run! We all sprinted deeper into the woods. I was still holding Nevy's hand, basically forcing her to get in front of me. Ross was trailing behind us a bit. As we ran, I could hear the man chasing after us, still screaming like a maniac. I felt like my heart was going to explode out of my chest. After what felt like forever, I finally saw a road approximately 60 feet away. I glanced behind me to see if the man was still there. And of course, he was, and he was gaining on us. Suddenly, I saw a pair of headlights approaching in the distance. I began waving my arms frantically, desperately trying to get the driver's attention. The deranged man clearly noticed the headlights as well, because he stopped chasing us and watched as we all made it out to the road. All of us were waving our arms trying to get the driver to stop. The headlights were coming from a minibus, which thankfully came to a stop. A middle-aged man quickly rushed out of the vehicle. What's going on here? Are you kids okay? No, there's a psycho in the woods trying to kill us. Well, come on then. I'll get you guys out of here. I cannot explain to you how lucky we were that a man driving an empty minibus happened to be traveling down that road. As he began to pull away, I look back, and I shit you not. Standing in the road, I saw the man who had chased us out of the woods. But then, someone else emerged from the trees and stood next to him. I told the others what I saw as the bus pulled away. I then looked at Faith. She could tell that I was clearly pissed off at her. "What the fuck were you thinking? I'm sorry, okay? You could have gotten us all killed." I sat back down next to Nevy, trying my best to calm down. I know that most of you are probably wondering why we didn't call the police. In all honesty, none of us wanted to own up to drinking. We thanked the guy for saving our asses, but he wanted to know more about what exactly happened back there. We just kind of stonewalled him, for the reason that I just mentioned. When he dropped us off at the shopping center, he said that he would call the police and report the incident. We all exited the bus and just sort of ran away. After that night, none of us wanted to hang out with Faith anymore. This wasn't the first time that her reckless behavior got us into trouble. Sure, a knife-wielding maniac in the woods is cause for concern, but you don't have to throw a fucking bottle at him. Perhaps there would have been a chance he would have left us alone if she hadn't done that. But then again, maybe that wasn't the case, because I still wonder about that second person that appeared on the road that night. Something deep down tells me it was the cab driver. I just can't overlook that strange remark he made after he dropped us off. I guess I'll see you later. Thank you for watching. If you have a story that you would like to share on this channel, please send it to my email, unit522stories@outlook.com. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button when notifications turned on. You can further support my channel by visiting the merch store. A link for that is in the description. You'll be hearing from me soon. Until next time, I'm your Uncle Unit. And as always, never forget. I am uncomfortable sharing certain details about my story, so I will be purposely vague. This story happened back when I was in middle school. Against my wishes, my mom enrolled me into an after-school program called ELP, which stands for Extended Learning Program. I already hated school, and being forced to stay there for an extra hour pissed me off. I would usually get out at 4, but with the program, I was there until 5. I did well in school and I didn't really need the extra time. My only guess is that my parents wanted me out of the house for another hour. My house was a short walk from the school, so I would usually be back by 5:20 at the latest. On the day in question, a huge storm passed through our town during the school day. When 5 o'clock rolled around, there was still an overcast in the sky, which made things darker than usual. As soon as I left the school grounds, I noticed this old station wagon moving slowly down the street toward me. Maybe it was just a confused grandmother of one of the students, unsure of where the drop-off was. I simply ignored it and continued on. It wasn't until I was a block down the road that I realized the vehicle was tailing me. I looked behind me to see something truly terrifying. Behind the wheel of the car was someone wearing a white mask with a creepy-ass smiley face on it. I should have taken off on foot, but instead I just stood there like an idiot as the car approached me. Soon, the wagon came to a stop next to me. I looked directly at the driver's creepy mask before a muffled voice spoke to me.
Hi.
I didn't respond.
Need a ride, kid?
I looked to the ground and shook my head. When I looked back, I was horrified to see that the driver was now pointing a gun at me. I took a few steps back. The driver then squeezed the trigger, and I heard a click.
Bang. You're dead.
The wagon then took off down the street. I stood there in total shock. Some jackass thought it was funny to point a gun at a 14-year-old kid. I ran home and immediately told my parents about what happened to me. The police were called. They ended up arresting the man a couple of hours later outside of a grocery store. Apparently he suffered from schizophrenia and was off of his meds. The gun he pointed at me was real, but was not loaded. Needless to say, he was locked up indefinitely. The good news is that after that happened, my parents felt really guilty, and I never had to go to that stupid after-school program ever again. This happened back in the late 90s when I was around 9 years old. To give you some background information, I grew up in a cul-de-sac toward the back of my neighborhood. Our school was only a mile down the road. The only crimes I ever heard about was when high school athletes would prank their teammates by covering their cars with toilet paper and Cool Whip. So needless to say, our parents never really worried about our safety. I was sitting in my front yard, waiting for my friend to get home from soccer practice. I suddenly heard a female shriek from somewhere close by. I looked over to see my next-door neighbor Heather running as fast as she could down the street, crying hysterically. She flew past me and into her house before I could even ask her what was going on. I then looked back to where she came from. There was a white car slowly cruising down our street. The vehicle looked severely rusted and beaten down. The kind of thing that wouldn't look out of place in a junkyard. Through the tinted windows, I saw a shadowy figure in the driver's seat. The car's engine revved up as it sped off and disappeared. I didn't see the details of the driver's face. However, I did see that they were looking directly at me as they took off. Even at my young age, I knew a threat when I saw one. Once the initial shock wore off, I ran inside. I don't know why I didn't tell my parents about the incident. I just kept telling myself that it was none of my business. Maybe it was Heather's boyfriend and they got into a fight or something. If she really was in some kind of danger, I would leave it to her to tell someone about it. A few days later, I overheard my mom talking to her friend about a predator that was trying to lure kids into a white van in the subdivision next to ours. I remembered cutting into the conversation and saying, "Mom, do you know if it was really a white car? Because I saw Heather the other day running away from someone in a white car." They completely ignored me, saying that it was rude to interrupt their conversation, and I shouldn't be joking about such a serious thing. I honestly don't remember what happened after this. Again, this was many years ago. To this day, I believe that Heather was only mere seconds away from being kidnapped. I also don't recall if they ever apprehended the suspect. I can only hope that they were never successful. This happened in 2018 in Portland, Oregon. I was 21 years old at the time. Back in those days, I was a night owl who did a fair amount of drinking. I was in downtown Portland one night and decided to stop and grab a quick drink after spending the day with some friends of mine. When I entered the pub, I noticed a very attractive girl sitting at the far end of the bar. She was wearing a hoodie, had a short hairstyle, and a pierced lip. I couldn't help but stare at her like some kind of weirdo. At this time I was still going to college. On campus, I've encountered many attractive girls on a daily basis, but I had never been so stunned like this before. Since we were the only ones at the bar, I felt that my behavior was becoming noticeable. So I made my way to the nearest stool, sat down, and ordered a rum and coke. I thought about striking up a conversation with the girl, but the last time I hit on somebody at a bar, I ended up with a drink on my face, a story for another time. To make a long story short, I didn't have the energy to play 4D chess that night. I'm just gonna have a few drinks, walk back to my dorm, and call it a night.
You look like a deer caught in the headlights.
I looked over, and the girl was now standing next to me. I was shocked. The last thing I ever expected was for her to come over and start talking to me. I had to think quickly. Sorry about that.
There's no need to apologize. It happens all the time.
I bet.
You're funny. Do you mind if I join you?
Please, be my guest. The girl took a seat next to me. So, are you from around here?
Oh, no. Actually, I just arrived in town.
Oh, really? Well, welcome to Portland. It's not as bad as people make it out to be, I promise. I'm David, by the way.
Nice to meet you, David. I'm Sadie.
Sadie and I talked for a while. I found out that she was originally from New York and relocated here to work for a property management company and to escape an abusive relationship. After hearing her story, I offered to buy her a drink, and we continued our talk. After about an hour, I realized that I had drank way too much. Hey, Sadie, I have to get going. It's a long walk back to my place, and I think I'm a bit drunk.
Well, you could always stay at my place. It's not far from here.
Are you sure? I mean, we did just meet. She then leaned toward me and rested her hand on my thigh.
I'm sure.
The thought of scoring with this girl did sober me up. So I paid off my tab, and we left the bar at around 10:30. We then made our way to the small parking lot behind the building.
It's just over there.
Sadie then led me to a green Subaru parked at the far end of the lot. Upon seeing the vehicle and noticing the Vermont plates, I got a bad feeling. Didn't she say she was from New York? I felt like a mouse about to enter an obvious trap, and so I stopped. Sadie, are you sure about this?
What's wrong, David?
I don't know, I just got this really bad feeling all of a sudden. I'm not trying to be funny or immature with this next part. I'm simply only relaying what happened. Sadie approached me and caressed my area.
Well, how do you feel now?
The strange feeling I had was quickly chased away and was replaced by something else. Oh, okay then. She walked over to the passenger side door and held it open for me. Before I knew it, I was inside the car of a stranger that I had met an hour ago. After Sadie closed the door, she began to walk around to the other side, but she did so very slowly. It was bizarre, almost as if she was pretending to be a zombie or something. That strange feeling from earlier returned. I remembered trying to open the passenger door, only to find that it was locked from the outside. Sadie stopped outside of the driver's side door and just stared at me through the smudged window. The dark parking lot obscured her features, making her resemble a dark figure. She then waved at me, and I heard her say,
Have a nice trip, David.
Don't ask me how, but I knew exactly what I had to do. I placed my right hand over my throat as a wire fell in front of my face and was pulled tight. There was someone in the back seat. If I didn't bring up my right hand when I did, the wire would have been right on my jugular. I heard the assailant in the back seat grunting as they pulled the wire tighter. As we struggled, Sadie opened the driver's side door. I could see that she was angry at what she saw.
You idiot, you're fucking it up.
A male voice boomed from the back seat.
Move his fucking hand!
Between the creeped out feeling from earlier and the literal attempt on my life, I was 100% sober now. Sadie climbed into the seat and reached for my hand. In all the excitement, she must have not noticed that my left hand was completely free. As soon as she moved in, I clocked her right in the face, sending her backward.
What the fuck? You just hit my girlfriend.
I felt the wire around my throat loosen, and I immediately took the opportunity and threw it off of me, and tried the handle on the passenger side door again. To my surprise, it opened. Before I knew it, I was running down the street as fast as I could. I ended up at a nearby convenience store, where I called the police. I gave them a detailed description of Sadie and the Subaru she was driving. I pretty much spent the rest of that evening giving my statement and answering more questions. I wasn't dropped off at the dorms until after 3 a.m. There have since been a few follow-ups to my case. It was determined that the Subaru was reported stolen earlier that evening. Sadie was clearly a false name, and she used a fake ID at the bar. This was also likely a case of what is known as lust murder. Sadie and her accomplice tried to murder me to fulfill a sadistic sexual desire. This is only a theory, but it does seem to fit. The perpetrators are still at large to this day. I am extremely lucky to be alive right now. If I hadn't raised my hand when I did, I have no doubt that I would have been strangled to death. I'll tell you one thing, that is the last time I'll ever try to pick someone up at a bar.